Picture a fire. It's 1957. A massive, roaring inferno tearing through a film storage vault in France, and the flames are just utterly feeding on cellulose nitrate film stock. And look, if you've ever handled early celluloid, you know this isn't just a regular fire, right? Nitrate is chemically terrifying. It's essentially a close cousin to gun cotton.
Oh yeah, it literally contains its own oxygen supply within the chemical structure.
Exactly, meaning it burns so intensely, so incredibly fast that you literally cannot extinguish it. Douse it in water, smother it in foam. It genuinely does not matter. It just keeps incinerating everything around it until there's nothing left but toxic gas and ash. And somewhere in the dead center of that blinding white inferno is a metal canister containing a single reel of film. It's the very last known print of the second half of an absolute cinematic masterpiece. And as that canister liquefies, an entire world, meticulously crafted, painstakingly shot, historically unprecedented world is permanently erased from existence. It is just a devastating, unparalleled loss for cinema history.
Hold your horses, a cinematic masterpiece. Are you having a laugh?
I am absolutely not having a laugh.
You're making it sound like the burning of the Library of Alexandria made. Let's be absolutely clear right out of the gate for everyone listening. It's a painful image for a film archivist. Sure, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But to call Erich von Stroheim's The Wedding March a masterpiece is a massive stretch. That fire wasn't a tragic assassination of art. It was essentially a mercy killing for a film that was bloated, self-indulgent, and structurally clunky as hell.
That is absolute nonsense. You've lost the plot before we've even properly started.
Cinema, the magic vehicle, a comprehensive guide. Journey 1, 1913 to 1950.
You're evaluating an uncompromising pioneer through the lens of a studio accountant. Like you, and you listening to us right now, who I know actually cares about the mechanical evolution of film. You know that in 1928, the American film industry was ruthlessly standardizing. The studio system was solidifying absolute power, turning visual storytelling into a rigid, factory-line business. Efficiency was the god they worshiped.
Which is how you build an actual sustainable industry.
No, wait, let me stop you before you go any further. Right in the middle of this streamlined, profit-driven machine stands Stroheim, delivering a 10-hour, two-part epic set in 1914 Vienna. 10 hours. The man had the sheer guts to execute a vision nobody else could even comprehend, demanding that a studio respect the psychological weight of his narrative, and you're calling him unhinged.
Yes. 10 hours. I don't buy it for a second that this was some noble artistic stand. Just because a filmmaker spends an absolute fortune, tortures his crew, and drags out every single solitary scene doesn't automatically make it art. He was a narcissist behind a lens. The studios looked at this monolithic 15,000-meter creation and predictably, rationally refused to release it as intended because it was a total train wreck of resource management.
A train wreck?
A total train wreck. If you can't tell your story in a reasonable time frame, you're failing the basic mechanics in the medium.
Hang on a minute. To understand why it had to be that long, you have to look at the historical pivot he was making. We're looking at the texts today, specifically excerpts from Cinema the Magic Vehicle and these incredible archival production notes, and they map this out perfectly. Before The Wedding March, Stroheim directed Greed.
Right, the Death Valley picture.
Exactly, a film famous for rolling around in the absolute grimy, desperate, lower social regions of humanity. But for this project, he does a complete 180 turn. He leaves the gutter and heads straight for the clits. He goes back to the land of his youth, Vienna, in the spring of 1914. He moves from the devastating poverty of greed to the absolute apex of European aristocracy. And the setting is sublime. It's pure magic. June 1914. This is a world teetering right on the edge of the abyss. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo happens mere weeks after the events in this film.
Yeah, the fragile aristocratic bubble right before the pin drops. It's a nice poetic idea on paper, but let's look at the actual execution on screen, which is ragged around the edges, to put it mildly. You talk about his meticulous recreation of this aristocratic bubble, how he's supposedly capturing the final exhale of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The man was famous for being a fanatic about details, yeah.
Unmatched in his attention to detail.
Unmatched, sure. Legend has it. He made actors wear period-accurate silk underwear, even if the camera couldn't see it, just so they'd walk with the proper imperial posture. But then, and this is where your whole uncompromising genius theory falls totally flat on its face, he completely bungles the central timeline of the film.
It is not a bungle, it's a calculated thematic compression.
No way, stop right there. Let's lay out the facts for the listener. He shoots this massive, solemn Corpus Christi procession leaving St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. and he insists on shooting this specific sequence in early Technicolor. Do you know how absurdly difficult two-color subtractive Technicolor was in 1928?
It was incredibly demanding, yes.
It was a nightmare. The cameras required a beam splitter prism. It demanded so much blinding arc lighting on set that the actors literally got actinic conjunctivitis, cleaved eyes, and the heat was like an oven. He tortures everyone for this expensive, rare shot. Historically, in 1914, Corpus Christi took place on June 11th. That's just 17 days before the assassination in Sarajevo. But in his own script, the main character's father explicitly orders him to get married on June 1st.
I know the dates. The father gives the ultimatum on June 1st, meaning the procession we see on screen, the inciting incident where the prince meets the harpist, happens technically after the marriage deadline he was just given.
Exactly. The timeline is completely broken. It's shoddy continuity. Why would a director who obsesses over the exact brass buttons on a cavalry uniform let a glaring calendar error slip through? Because he was so obsessed with his own grandiose set pieces that he lost track of basic narrative logic. It's amateurish.
Come off it. You're looking at this like a continuity supervisor with a clipboard instead of a film historian. If we actually engage with who Stroheim was as an artist, we have to look past the literal Wikipedia dates. Yes, he was obsessed with physical authenticity, the metals, the architecture, the lighting. But for Stroheim, emotional and thematic truth always superseded literal calendar dates. It was a stroke of brilliance to force those events together.
Oh, pull the other one. Emotional truth is just the excuse directors use when they're too disorganized to read a calendar.
No, listen. What is actually happening in that procession? It's the ultimate collision of religion, state power, romantic yearning, and familial duty. By compressing the timeline, by forcing the religious spectacle to overlap with the father's suffocating deadline in a way they historically didn't, he heightens the psychological pressure on his characters. The exact date of June 11th doesn't matter to the audience. What matters is the crushing weight of the Catholic Church, the dying empire, and the financial ruin of his family, all bearing down on Prince Nicky at the exact same moment. It's expressionism masquerading as realism.
That's a massive stretch. You're doing his homework for him? You're saying he broke the timeline on purpose to create psychological pressure. I say he shot a wildly expensive Technicolor parade because he liked parades, and then realized in the editing room his script dates didn't match and just shrugged it off. It's half-baked.
I don't buy that for a second. That obsession with emotional truth, with the pressure cooker of society, brings us right into the core of the film's plot. Because what is being crushed here isn't just a political empire, it's human intimacy. It's a romance being crushed by the almighty dollar. Which brings us to Prince Nicky, this cynical, womanizing, aristocratic officer in the Imperial Guards. And in a move of absolute auteur dominance, he's played by Stroheim himself.
Auteur dominance. Huh? Try unmitigated vanity. Of course, he casts himself as the irresistible royal rogue.
He understood his own screen presence better than anyone. So Nicky is at this massive Corpus Christi procession. Suddenly, a horse shies. It startles a young woman in the crowd. A poor cafe harpist named Mitzi, played phenomenally well by Fay Wray. She falls, twists her ankle, and Nicky is captivated. It's the classic enduring setup, right? The cynical aristocrat and the innocent working-class girl.
But the fairy tale crashes into a brick wall because Nicky's aristocratic family, the von Wilderly-Brauffenbergs, are flat broke. Their centuries-old title is essentially their only remaining liquid asset.
Right. So to save the family from absolute financial ruin, Nicky is forced into a marriage of convenience with Cecilia. Now, Cecilia is the disabled daughter of, and this is a brilliant detail from my research, a licentious cornplaster magnate named Magnus. It's a specific, unglamorous, grotesque type of new wealth, cornplaster. And at the exact same time, poor Mitzi, the harpist, is being forced by her own circumstances to marry a man named Shanini, who is described as a primitive, brutish butcher.
The contrast is completely heavy-handed. You have this supposedly pure love that blossoms under softly lit apple trees to the sound of nightingales, and it is systematically dismantled by the crude financial necessities of the upper class. The sources we're analyzing make this sweeping, grand argument that the film is a passionate defense of pure feelings assaulted by money. But frankly, it feels a bit rich coming from a director who was burning through studio cash like it was kindling to shoot an apple orchard scene.
You're conflating the production budget with the textual meaning, which is intellectually lazy. What's genuinely phenomenal work here, what completely blew my mind in the analysis, is the distinction Stroheim makes about class. Even though we are dealing with princes on one side and cafe harpists on the other, his films aren't strictly class-conscious in the traditional Marxist sense. The dividing line isn't rich versus poor.
Yeah, the texts argue that the decisive factor for Stroheim is time. Specifically, how long an individual has been corrupted by money.
Exactly. It's not about the current balance of your bank account. It's about the half-life of your moral decay. The aristocracy, Nikki's family, they have been corrupted for centuries. Their rot is systemic, institutional. The newly rich industrialist, the corn plaster magnate, he is freshly corrupted, vulgar, and loud about his wealth. And the poor butcher Shani, he is viciously aspiring to that corruption. Money is just the active agent that throws these people into antagonistic camps. They are all compromised. It's just a matter of degree and duration.
It's an interesting theory on paper, I'll give the book that much, but on screen, it translates to some utterly flat, grotesque caricatures. Look at the famous brothel scene. You have the aristocratic Prince Nicky's father and the bourgeois corn plaster magnate Magnus. They are both dead drunk, lying literally on the floor under a massive oak table, covered in spilled wine and cigar ash, hammering out the marriage of their children.
It strips away every single ounce of polite veneer from high society. It's a jaw-dropping sequence.
It's clunky as hell. It's a laughably weak metaphor. We get it, Eric. They are base, they are animals, they are underneath the table of civilized society. You don't need a sledgehammer to make that point.
You absolutely do, when your audience is complicit in that exact same behavior. If you've ever worked in corporate law or finance, you know this scene is dead accurate. Think of massive corporate mergers today. Two monolithic companies merge, and the PR departments release these flowery statements about the unification of families and shared cultural values. But behind closed doors, it's just two executives at a high-end steakhouse, slightly drunk, trading human assets, thousands of employees, subsidiaries, or in this film's case, their own flesh and blood children to balance a ledger. It's a pure, ruthless transaction dressed up as a holy sacrament. Stroheim puts that exact transaction under a microscope. Look. The academic foundation in cinema, the magic vehicle, is razor sharp on this point, and we need to get into it. Klinowski and Garbicz break down how Stroheim wasn't just throwing these grotesque shots together for shock value. He was forging a completely new cinematic vocabulary from scratch. They rank this film as a towering milestone for a reason. He pushed the medium forward because he had the sheer guts to execute a vision nobody else could even comprehend.
Wait, I'm the one defending the film. Are you finally agreeing with me?
Come off it. I'm citing the book to tell you why the book is wrong. I reckon the authors are giving him a massive free pass here. You and Klinowski call it visionary courage, but from where I'm sitting, it looks like a colossal ego trip. The book defends every single frame through this cozy, reverent historical lens, claiming his aggressive imagery shares hallmarks with the surrealist master Louis Buñuel.
Which it absolutely does. Buñuel, who famously sliced an eyeball with a straight razor in Un Chien Andalou to wake up the audience, Stroheim is operating on that exact same frequency of visual shock. How does a director indict moral corruption without just having a character stand in front of the camera and deliver a boring theatrical monologue about it? You use stark, shocking visual contrasts. Stroheim uses brutal eroticism, naturalistic exaggeration, and ostentatious baseness.
Ostentatious baseness.
Yeah.
A fancy academic phrase for he liked filming ugly things.
No, look at the specific visual evidence from the text. He brings back the motif of caged birds, which he used so brilliantly in Greed, to visually symbolize how these characters are trapped by their rigid financial realities. But the real punch, the true artistry, is in the editing and the juxtaposition of those elements.
You mean the tonal whiplash? Because that's what it is, a right mess.
The collision of opposites. You have these incredibly tender, pure love scenes with Nikki and Mitzi, softly lit apple blossoms catching the sunlight, heavy religious iconography, the sound of nightingales implied in the silent frame. And then, without warning, he crashes those beautiful, delicate, fragile images directly into calculated displays of sadism from the butcher, Shani, or the heartbreaking physical deficiency of Cecilia limping through her opulent cage.
But here's where I have the challenge of this whole defense, both yours and the book's. The text says that this film prees the accusations against him that he was a dangerous anarchist, a perverted cynic, were unjust. It says audiences of 1928 fell into the trap of thinking to show is to endorse. But I don't buy it for a second. Isn't it highly likely Stroheim just enjoyed rolling in the cinematic mud? Audiences at the time were repulsed. They thought it was a pessimistic, vulgar display of base instincts. Why should we give him the benefit of the doubt that this was purely a high-minded moral crusade? Why is he exempt from being judged as a provocateur just looking for a cheap reaction?
Because you can't expose the rot if you refuse to show the maggots. That is the fundamental requirement of satire and tragedy. A banal marriage of convenience happens every single day in high society. It's mundane. To make it an authentic, visceral tragedy, Stroheim forces the audience to look at the ugly, unvarnished, sweaty truth of human transactional behavior. The discomfort the audience felt, the accusations of cynicism that they hurled at him, that was the medicine working. He wasn't endorsing the rot, he was shoving the audience's face in it because they were actively complicit in a society that operated exactly that way. He's holding up a mirror, and you are just like the audience in 1928 are getting mad at the reflection.
Nonsense. You're completely missing the forest for the trees. It's not an ego trip. Wait, sorry. I mean, it is an ego trip. You're the one defending it. The book provides all this precise historical context and technical breakdown that supposedly directly influenced modern cinema. But any rational viewer today would tell you to throw half that footage in the bin, chop 40 minutes out of the middle, and you might actually have a watchable picture. It's bloated.
If your attention span finds high-level visual storytelling a bit of a grind, that's your problem, not the film's. The authors of Cinema: The Magic Vehicle make a profoundly bold claim that validates his maximalist approach. They argue that the wedding march is the sole cinematic equivalent to the literary lost generation, and this completely recontextualizes everything you are complaining about.
Right, the lost generation. Let's dissect this, because I think the authors are reaching desperately here to legitimize a messy film by attaching it to great literature. We usually think of the lost generation purely in terms of novelists, right? The young people who survived the mechanized slaughter of the trenches in World War I, completely traumatized, totally at odds with the older generation, who cynically sent them to die for profit and empire.
Exactly. And the sources connect Stroheim's thematic rebellion directly to the literary giants of that era. You have F. Scott Fitzgerald writing about the deep, glittering despair of the Jazz Age, how old money fundamentally corrupts pure love in The Great Gatsby. You have William Faulkner in The American South, utilizing stream of consciousness and dense, nonlinear allegories to process the inescapable decay of the old world.
And you have Ernest Hemingway with his incredibly disciplined, understated, paratactic sentence structure, capturing male-dominated post-war disillusionment. Think of Jake Barnes in The Sun, Also Rises, where the protagonist literally carries an unhealable physical war wound that physically prevents him from consummating his love. Hemingway was about what you leave out the iceberg theory. Stroheim is about cramming every single thing into the frame until it bursts. They are diametrically opposed in execution.
In execution, perhaps, but not in mechanism of processing trauma. Both are reacting to a completely broken world. Hemingway strips the language bare because words lost their meaning in the war. Stroheim overwhelms the visual frame because the opulence of the pre-war era was overwhelmingly suffocating. The text points out that cinema entirely lagged behind literature. The Wedding March is the only film of its era capturing this specific, devastating generational trauma. Why is that? Why was cinema so far behind the novelists in addressing the lost youth?
It's basic economics, mate. Literature is dirt cheap to produce. A novelist like Hemingway can sit in a freezing cafe in Paris and pour his PTSD onto a page with a rented typewriter. Cinema, especially 1928, requires massive capital. It requires sound stages, hundreds of extras, massive lighting rigs, corporate investors. The people controlling the purse strings in Hollywood, the bankers, were absolutely not interested in alienating their paying audiences with depressing post-war despair. They wanted escapism. They wanted happy endings, Clairabeau, and massive box office returns.
Which is exactly why Stroheim had to be brilliantly subversive. What's phenomenal here is that he retrofits post-war disillusionment onto a pre-war setting. He's taking the cynicism, the feeling of being utterly trapped by the greed of the older generation, the absolute inevitability of tragedy, and he's projecting it backward onto the society of 1914 that caused the war in the first place. He's showing the underlying disease before the symptoms broke out into open warfare.
That's a lovely academic theory, but to capture themes that monumental, you need a monumental canvas. Which brings us to the absolute tragic reality of this film's production. And this is where your defense of his genius completely falls apart. Let's talk about the 15,250 meters.
Here we go.
Yes, here we go, because the numbers here are just staggering and, frankly, indefensible. The film is initially financed by an independent producer named P.A. Powers. They are shooting and shooting and shooting, day after day, burning through cash. Finally, Powers wakes up, looks at the ledger, and suspends production when only 85% of the script is actually complete. They take the raw footage they have, they do a preliminary edit, and the rough cut is 15,250 meters long.
And it was glorious.
For our modern sensibilities, that is literal miles and miles of celluloid. Doing the math on 1928 projection speeds roughly 90 feet per minute. That translates to roughly 8 to 10 hours of continuous screen time.
The physical reality of that is awe-inspiring. Think of the editors in the cutting room, physically surrounded by 50,000 feet of film, slicing it by hand with razor blades and film cement.
It's not awe-inspiring, it's a total train wreck. The source explicitly points out Stroheim's fatal flaw here. He was a genius at framing a shot. Fine, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But he never recognized the dramatic potential of film editing. He lacked the discipline to cut his own work. He was notoriously, pathologically unable to be brief. He actually went to the distributors and proposed, with a straight face, splitting the movie into 2 5-hour parts to be shown on consecutive nights.
Which is visionary.
Are you taking the mic? In the studio system of 1928, that is commercial suicide. Theaters needed turnover to survive. They needed to play a film 3-4 times a day to make a profit. A 5-hour film completely ruins the business model. You can't expect an audience to sit in a theater for 5 hours, go home, sleep, and come back the next night for another 5 hours just to see if the butcher gets his revenge.
Why not? We do it today. It's exactly like a modern auteur today handing over their footage to a prestige streaming service and refusing to edit it. Here's a 10-hour limited series. Binge it. Stroheim was just 70 years ahead of his time. He was inventing the cinematic miniseries, but he was trapped in a distribution model that only understood 90-minute disposable entertainment. It is an act of visionary brilliance destroyed by logistical cowards.
Logistical cowards. You mean people who actually want to keep the lights on in the cinema?
Right.
This inevitably leads to the conflict, and frankly, the studio was entirely in the right. Jesse J. Lasky takes over the distribution for Paramount, and the clash begins. You have a year of brutal, agonizing negotiations. The so-called visionary artist against the studio ledger.
And the ledger always wins, which is the true tragedy. The result is that Part 1 is violently slashed to 40% of its original length. That butchered compromise cut is what was released to the public as the wedding march. But the real historical crime scene is what happened to the second half, the part that was titled The Honeymoon.
Oh, this is where the story gets incredibly messy.
Yeah.
Because the story doesn't end with the marriages. According to the original sprawling script, Nicky and his new disabled wife Cecilia go on their honeymoon in the Tyrolean Alps. And surprisingly, even though they were forced into this horrific financial transaction, a genuine tender affection starts to develop between them.
See, it's a beautifully human touch. He's not just a cynic. The transaction starts to become a real layered relationship.
Meanwhile, back in Vienna, Mitzi has married the butcher, Shani. But Shani is still seizing with violent jealousy over the prince. So he decides to pack up, go to the Alps, and assassinate Nicky during a mountain hunt. He tracks him to a hunting lodge, fires a bullet through a window, which is a remarkably cowardly and petty way to kill someone, by the way.
Yeah.
But he misses Nicky. Instead, he mortally wounds Cecilia.
The innocent bystander in this entire ruthless financial transaction pays the ultimate physical price. The killer panics and flees into the mountains. Mitzi, feeling completely morally responsible for this whole tragedy because Shani was her husband, enters a convent to seek penance. And the only person who is actually thrilled about any of this is Nicky's mother, the old, decaying princess, because the aristocratic family secured the cornplaster money, and now the socially embarrassing disabled daughter-in-law is conveniently dead.
It is remarkably bleak, yes.
Yeah.
But the studio looks at this massive, unfinished, depressing second half, and they decide they've had absolutely enough of Stroheim's endless demands. They snatched the film away from him completely. And honestly, good on them.
Good on them. They handed it to Erich von Stroheim, another legendary director, yes, but in this case, he was brought in essentially as a corporate hitman for the project. Stroheim, completely ignoring Stroheim's furious, screaming protests, added a cheap recap prologue to explain the first film, and then mindlessly cut around 30% of the remaining footage.
He didn't mindlessly cut it. He fundamentally tightened the dramatic structure. The omissions mentioned in the text were the lengthy wedding night scenes and the final climactic physical fight between the two rivals, Nicky and Shani.
And this is where the studio's cynical interference accidentally creates a massive thematic shift. I know you're going to love this because you love studio butchery. Stroheim's original authored script had a definitive moral ending. After the outbreak of the First World War, Shani the Butcher was supposed to be drafted and die violently in battle. That would leave Nicky and Mitzi free to finally reunite and get married before Nicky departs for the front line himself. It was a triumph of true love emerging from the ashes of the empire.
A glimmer of hope amidst the ruin. A very traditional 19th century narrative resolution.
Exactly. But because Sternberg hacked out the fight scenes and rearranged the ending to save running time,
Shawnee, the villain, just flees the hunting lodge and completely survives. The title card at the end abruptly comes up, and the murderous butcher is still out there, unpunished. This is a totally unique occurrence in Stroheim's strictly moralist cinema, a villain walking away scot-free.
It breaks his usual moral framework entirely. And I'll say it, Sternberg accidentally made a masterpiece out of a shoddy, bloated ego trip. Doesn't Sternberg's botched, cynical ending actually fit your precious Lost Generation theme vastly better than Stroheim's original saccharine happy ending? Think about it logically. World War I was defined by senseless mechanical loss, where the war criminals and villains often survived in comfort and innocent foot soldiers died in the mud. Stroheim wanted a fairy tale where true love wins out, but the studio's impatient butchery accidentally created a brilliantly modernist conclusion where the innocent die randomly, the bad guy gets away without consequence, and the rich consolidate their wealth. Isn't that infinitely more modern?
That is a deeply cynical paradox, and I hate that you're partially right about the thematic resonance, but I refuse to praise studio butchery. Stroheim was a moralist. He desperately wanted the universal scales to balance eventually, even if it took a global war to do it. He wanted a 19th century moral resolution to a 20th century psychological trauma. The studio, acting purely out of impatience and commercial greed, imposed a genuinely modernist ending. They violently left the wound open. The senselessness of Cecilia dying and Shawnee surviving perfectly mirrors the senseless, unresolved trauma of the trenches. They accidentally made the film more devastatingly true to the Lost Generation than the auteur himself planned.
It's precisely like the studio's commercial cynicism completed the artistic vision by pure accident. It's brilliant.
But Stroheim didn't see it that way, and rightly so. It was a mutilation of his work. He was furious. He slapped a legal veto on the honeymoon. Because of his veto, this mutilated second part was never shown in the United States.
It was essentially exiled.
Yeah.
Cast out. It was only released in France under the title Mariage de France and in Sweden.
And this leads to the most heartbreaking reality of physical film media. Because it wasn't widely distributed, because it wasn't carefully protected in massive studio vaults across the US, the few existing prints were incredibly vulnerable to the elements. Nitrate decomposes, it turns to sticky jelly and then to highly flammable dust, and gradually, over the decades, the prints were destroyed. Which brings us tragically back to our opening image, 1957. The very last known print of the honeymoon goes up in smoke in a vault fire.
It is the ultimate nightmare for film preservationists, so I'll grant you that. Even if I think the film was a bloated mess, a piece of cultural history, a vital link in understanding one of cinema's most notoriously difficult directors, just turned to ash.
But there is a sort of beautiful resurrection story here. Our sources detail what happened in 1975. A man named Herman G. Weinberg at the Museum of Modern Art in New York undertook this painstaking, obsessive reconstruction of the film.
Since the moving celluloid footage of the honeymoon was entirely gone, Weinberg had to rely on whatever scrap survived. Production stills.
Exactly. He used 261 stop frames, still photographs taken on set by the script supervisors, to painstakingly fill in the missing narrative gaps. It allowed the American premiere of the full story, or at least the haunting ghost of the full story, to finally happen nearly 50 years after it was shot.
Look, if we connect this back to how you and I and everyone listening consumes media today, it highlights something profound. Today, everything is instantly backed up in the cloud. We shoot a 4K video on our phone, and within seconds it exists redundantly on a server in 3 different continents simultaneously. We arrogantly assume our digital history is permanent.
We take for granted that art will just always be available on demand.
Right. But the physical vulnerability of early cinema is genuinely terrifying. We have to consider how much of our cultural history, how many masterpieces, and yes, how many self-indulgent messes have been permanently erased. Sometimes by a stray spark in a vault, and sometimes by a studio executive's impatience in the cutting room. The Wedding March survived, but only as a scarred amputee.
It's chilling when you realize how fragile the medium is. Okay, let's step back and look at the absolute battlefield of a journey we've been on with this material today. We started in the meticulously detailed, emotionally compressed timeline of 1914 Vienna. We fought our way through the Buñuel-esque visual critiques of money, where the duration of your corruption matters vastly more than your social class.
We argued over whether a director was legitimately trying to process the trauma of the Lost Generation by projecting it backward onto the society that caused it, or if he was just throwing money at the screen in a fit of narcissism.
And we watched a 15,000-meter colossus of a production literally go up in smoke, pieced back together half a century later with 261 still photographs.
It is, without a doubt, a history of incredible, perhaps foolish ambition colliding violently with hard commercial reality.
Which leaves me with one final thought. We mourn the loss of Stroheim's complete unedited vision. We lament the studio butchery and the 1957 fire. But if he'd gotten his way, if the distributors had somehow miraculously agreed to release a 10-hour, perfectly realized, two-part epic in 1928, would it have become the towering legend it is today? Or does the tragedy of the fire, the 261 stop frames, and the brutal studio interference actually elevate the wedding march? Does the violence done to the film itself make it the ultimate physical testament to the lost generation? Perhaps it's not just a movie anymore, it's a cinematic ghost story.
Look, we've argued through dozens of these so-called masterpieces on our show today, and we're clearly never going to see eye to eye on this one. If you want to judge for yourself whether I am just being an insufferable cynic or if the book actually proves its point about Stroheim's genius, go grab a copy of Cinema: The Magic Vehicle. The link is right at the top of the description. Do you have the actual appetite to digest real, uncompromising film history, or are you staying lazy? Your call.
Something for you to ponder the next time you hit play on a perfectly polished, mathematically tested, completely risk-free, modern blockbuster.